Professor Hargrove's voice cut through the packed classroom when he stopped in front of the young man and spoke loud so everyone could hear. He said, "You think you can walk into my class smelling like grease, covered in filth, and still expect me to take you seriously?" Marcus didn't lift his eyes. He held his old backpack against his chest and swallowed in silence, while the whole room laughed. What the professor didn't know, what nobody in that room full of well-dressed people knew, was that every dark stain on that shirt had a name, an hour of the night, and a reason. That dirt wasn't laziness. It was the proof of 3 jobs in a single night, of a 22-year-old boy carrying a whole family on his back so none of them would ever sleep on the street. The college was one of those expensive places, new building, floors polished till they shined, where most students rolled up in this year's car and designer clothes. Professor Hargrove was the king of that place, not on paper, but in the way he carried himself. He'd taught business for 20 years, and on day one he liked to say only people with class survived there. To him, class meant fine clothes, clean shoes, and a well-known family name. That morning, he walked in wearing a spotless dark blue suit, shoes gleaming, and ran his eyes over the class like a man checking merchandise. That's when he froze. In the back of the room, kind of hunched in a chair, sat a young man in a faded shirt, pants patched at the knee, and dark circles that ran halfway down his face. Marcus had gotten there 5 minutes early, straight from work, no time to even stop by home. What the professor saw was a stranger who didn't belong, a mistake that needed fixing. What he didn't see, because he never bothered to really look, was the notebook full of careful notes, the pen worn down from use, and the shine in the eyes of a boy who'd fought his whole life to sit in that chair. That day, the professor decided he was going to have some fun at the boy's expense. Marcus lived in a 2-room shack on the far edge of the neighborhood, a place where the bus only came once an hour. He shared that cramped space with his mother, Miss Cora, and 2 younger siblings, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Pete. The father had vanished 3 years back, didn't even leave an address. And from that day on, the whole house fell on the shoulders of the oldest son. Miss Cora had come down with a bad heart the year before and couldn't work anymore. She spent her days sitting in the doorway, waiting for her son to come home, with an expensive medicine she had to buy every month. Marcus had made a silent promise, looking at his 2 little siblings asleep on the mattress on the floor. None of those 3 would ever go hungry, and none would quit school, whatever it cost. To pull it off, he worked 3 jobs in a single night. From 10 at night to 4 in the morning. He was a night watchman and cleaner at a truck depot, and he also helped the graveyard shift mechanic tighten up whatever needed it. That's where the grease on his clothes came from, that heavy smell that stuck to his shirt and wouldn't come out even with soap, because there was never enough soap or enough time to wash it right. From 5 to 7 in the morning, he unloaded sacks of flour and baked bread at a bakery near home, and his pay was the day's cash plus the squashed loaves left over, which he'd carry inside so nobody woke up without breakfast. Then he'd rush to the college. And in the late afternoon, while his classmates went home to rest, he still delivered lunch boxes by bike until the night started it all over again. Sleep, he grabbed on the bus, standing up, or in the 20 minutes between one job and the next, leaning against a wall. His body ached all the time, his hands were always torn up, and the dark circles were just part of his face now. But he never complained to anyone, never told a soul at the college what he carried, because he had a quiet kind of pride. He didn't want pity, he wanted a diploma. Only that would pull his family out of that hole. Inside his notebook, tucked between the pages of notes, Marcus kept a small, crumpled photo of the 3 of them. Him in the middle, Lily laughing on one side and gap-toothed Pete on the other. Every time the urge to quit squeezed him, in the middle of the freezing night, he'd pull that photo out of his pocket, look at it for a second, and put it back. That little piece of paper was the engine that got him up every day. He'd gotten into that college with the top score on the scholarship exam. He was the only scholarship student in the class, the only one who didn't pay, and he knew that if he got even 1 low grade, he'd lose it all. So he studied on the bus, in the bathroom line, under the street light, While the others slept 8 hours in a good bed, he ripped knowledge out of the hours nobody else wanted. And nobody at all, imagined the size of that fight. It didn't take long for Professor Hargrove to find his first excuse. One morning in the second week, he stopped in the middle of his explanation, sniffed the air with his nose all twisted, and walked slow to the back of the room, where Marcus was trying to shrink into his chair. He stopped right in front of him, crossed his arms and said, not lowering his voice, "Where's that smell coming from? Did anybody here take a shower today?" The whole class froze for a second, and then burst into a muffled laugh. Marcus felt his face burn, but he didn't drop his head from shame. He dropped it so nobody would see the anger and the hurt mixed in his eyes. The professor liked the effect. He spun around to his audience like a man on a stage and kept going, pointing at the boys' clothes. He said, "This is a room full of future leaders, not a junkyard." He said, "Take a good look at him. Stained shirt, holes in his shoes, reeking of grease. You think any company out there is going to hire a man who shows up like this? Here we make winners. And a winner, my dear students, starts with the mirror." Every word dropped like a stone. Marcus squeezed his pen so hard his fingers went white. The young man didn't answer. He could have told them right there, in front of everyone, that the grease came from 6 hours of work in the dead of night, that the smell was the smell of the bread he carried home to his siblings. But he didn't. He dropped his eyes to his notebook and kept copying the lesson, his hand shaking, because in his head, one thing was certain. He hadn't come there to fight. He'd come to learn. Before heading back to the front, Professor Hargrove leaned down a little, got close to Marcus's ear, and said low, just for him, a line that would keep pounding in the boy's head for weeks. "A stain on your clothes is a stain on your character, boy. People who are dirty on the outside are usually dirty on the inside too." And he walked off, straightening his own expensive suit, pleased with himself. A girl in the front row, Bianca, turned her face and sat there watching Marcus with a tightness in her chest. She'd seen him answer, the class before, a question nobody else in the room could, and she hadn't forgotten it. But nobody had the nerve to say a thing. In that room, going against Professor Hargrove was signing your own failing grade, and everyone knew it. So the silence won. When class ended, Marcus was the last one out. He gathered his things slow, put the photo that had slipped from his notebook back in its place, and walked down the hallway with his head down, feeling his classmates' eyes on his back. Only when he reached the bathroom, locked the stall door, and pressed his forehead against the cold wall, did he let one tear fall. Just one. Then he washed his face and went to work. That night, at the truck depot, he scrubbed the floor thinking about quitting the whole thing. But then he remembered his mother sitting in the doorway, the medicine on top of the fridge, little Pete asking him to tell a story before bed. He wiped the sweat off his forehead with his dirty arm and picked up the mop again. Quitting wasn't a luxury he got to choose. It never had been. What Marcus didn't know was that first humiliation had only been the beginning. To Professor Hargrove, he'd become entertainment, an easy target to make the class laugh and feel important. And while the boy scrubbed floors in the dead of night to support 3 people back at the college without him doing a single thing wrong, a cruel plan was already starting to take shape in the professor's head. If that scene put a knot in your chest just now, drop a like and tell me down in the comments. In Marcus's shoes, would you have swallowed it quiet or answered the professor in front of everyone? I read every single one. From that day on, there wasn't a single class where Professor Hargrove didn't find a way to needle Marcus. If the boy showed up a minute late, because the bus had broken down, the professor would stop everything and say, "Well, look who decided to honor us with his presence." If he yawned from exhaustion, here it came. "Are we interrupting your sleep, sir?" The class laughed, and the professor fed on it. But there was one thing the professor couldn't take away from the boy: his grades. On every exam, Marcus scored the highest in the room by a mile. He got right what the classmates in expensive clothes got wrong, and that, instead of softening the professor, made him even angrier. Because deep down, way down, It bothered him to see that raggedy boy smarter than the whole class put together. So Professor Hargrove started looking for a way to knock Marcus out for good. He began assigning expensive projects, ones that meant buying materials, printing color packets, paying for site visits to companies. He knew the scholarship kid didn't have money for that. It was a trap set with care. If the boy couldn't turn it in, he'd lose points, lose the scholarship, and vanish from the room forever. Clean, without dirtying his own hands. Marcus gave it everything he had. He worked 2 extra shifts at the bakery, skipped lunch to scrape together the money for the packet, walked 3 miles on foot to save the bus fare. He turned in everything, every impossible project the professor dreamed up. He handed in, even if it was written by hand under the streetlight, even if his hand was numb from hauling sacks of flour all night. But the body has a limit. Marcus started losing weight, going pale, his hands shaking from all the exhaustion and so little food. His siblings noticed their oldest brother barely slept anymore. Miss Cora, sick as she was, saw her son wasting away and cried in secret in the kitchen, not knowing what to do, because she had no way to help, and that hurt her more than her own illness. One night, little Pete woke up thirsty and found his brother still on his feet, hunched over the notebook at the kitchen table, fighting off sleep to finish a project. The boy came close, rested his head on his brother's arm, and said softly, "Bubba, don't you ever sleep?" Marcus gave a tired smile, ran his hand through his brother's hair, and answered, "I'll sleep when you've got a good future." In one of those classes, Professor Hargrove actually grabbed Marcus's notebook off the desk, flipped through it with a sneer in front of the class, and when he saw the little photo of the 3 siblings fall to the floor, he let out a snicker and said, "Collecting stickers, are we? You ought to be saving up for decent clothes." He bent down, picked up the photo by the corner, and tossed it back on the desk. Marcus took the photo, wiped it careful, and put it away, silent. At the college, the noose kept tightening. During a group presentation, Professor Hargrove let Marcus speak last and, right in the middle of the boy's part, cut him off. "Enough. Nobody can focus with that smell. Do us the favor and sit down." Marcus's whole group pulled away from him, ashamed to be standing there with him. The boy sat down, swallowing it all one more time, and never even finished showing his work, which was the best in the class. That's when Bianca, the girl in the front row, really started to notice. She saw Marcus's hands, full of calluses and cuts. She saw his lunch, which a lot of days was just bread. She saw him sleeping, sitting up on the hallway bench during break. And something inside her didn't add up. How could a boy this smart, this hard-working, be the thing the professor painted him as? Something there was very, very wrong. Professor Hargrove, meanwhile, had decided to go for the final blow. He was going to wait for the day of the biggest presentation of the semester, the one worth half the grade, held in the big auditorium in front of the other classes and some of the faculty. Right there, he planned to humiliate Marcus in a way the boy would never lift his head again. What he couldn't imagine was that that day would turn everything inside out. The day of the semester's hardest exam arrived. Marcus studied wherever he could, scored the highest in the class again, came within a hair of a perfect mark. When Professor Hargrove graded it and saw that name at the top of the list, the raggedy boy's name above all the rich kids in the room, something inside him went sour for good. He didn't accept it. He simply couldn't accept that it was true. The next class, he walked in with the exams in his hand, dropped the stack on the desk, and said to the room, looking straight at the back, "Somebody here scored a perfect mark. But I don't believe in miracles. People who show up in this state, no money, no preparation, don't earn a perfect mark on my exam, honestly." The whole class turned around, and every eye landed on Marcus. The professor walked over to him, holding the boy's exam up in the air like it was evidence of a crime, and said loud, "You cheated. There's no other explanation. A student who barely has clothes to wear doesn't have the brains to ace this. I'm taking this to administration and asking for your expulsion. And there goes your little scholarship." The room went silent with shock. Somebody let out a nervous laugh. It was the only time Marcus lifted his head and looked the professor in the eyes. His voice came out low but steady, no shaking. "I didn't cheat, Professor. I studied." That was all. 4 words. Professor Hargrove let out a dry laugh and shot back in front of everyone. "Studied? With what time when you can barely stay awake? Don't lie to me, kid." And he tore the exam in half, right there in front of the whole class. The sound of the paper ripping echoed through the room. The perfect exam, the result of sleepless nights studying under the streetlight, became 2 pieces in the professor's hand, and he dropped them on Marcus's desk with contempt. He said, "You've got until next week to prove you deserve to be here in front of administration and everyone. If you can't prove it, you're out." And he turned his back, feeling like the master of truth. Marcus looked at the 2 pieces of paper on his desk and felt the ground disappear under his feet. It wasn't the grade that hurt. It was the accusation. After everything he'd swallowed in silence, all the hidden sacrifice, now they were calling him a liar and a thief in front of everyone. He gathered the pieces careful, put them inside his notebook, next to the photo of his siblings, and left the room without another word. That night he couldn't work right. He punched the clock wrong at the depot, nearly cut himself at the bakery from all the thinking. The idea of losing the scholarship, of losing the one chance to give a better life to his mother and siblings over a lie, squeezed his throat like a rope. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus really thought about giving it all up. He sat down on the curb, hid his face in his hands, and cried. When he got home in the dead of night, Miss Cora was awake, waiting. She saw her son's face and didn't need to ask. She pulled him close, in the weak way she could manage, and said in his ear, "Son, dirty clothes wash out. Lies other people tell about you, time washes those out too. Don't bow your head to anybody who's never carried the weight you carry." And Marcus cried in his mother's arms like he hadn't cried since he was a little boy. The next morning, eyes swollen, he made a decision. He wasn't going to quit. He'd go to administration, he'd prove he studied, he'd show the torn exam, he'd tell them everything if he had to. Not for himself, but for Lily, for little Pete, for his mother waiting in the doorway. If staying meant cracking his whole life open in front of strangers, then he'd crack it open. He got home from work, washed with a cup and a bucket, and went to the college set on it. In the hallway, before class, Bianca did something nobody had done. She sat down next to Marcus. No disgust, no laughing. She looked at him and asked quietly, "Why don't you tell them the truth? Why do you let him say those things and not defend yourself?" Marcus stayed quiet a while, looking at the floor, and then answered, "Because a man who works honest doesn't owe anybody an explanation for his clothes." Bianca sat there looking at that boy with calloused hands and the dignity of a grown man, and felt something grow in her chest, somewhere between admiration and outrage. In that moment, she made a decision Marcus had no idea about. She was going to uncover the truth about that boy, whatever it took, and when she did, the whole world would know. Professor Hargrove didn't know it, but he'd just woken up the wrong person. That same afternoon, when Marcus rushed out of the college almost running, Bianca went after him, from a distance, without him seeing. She watched the boy grab an old bike tied to a post and pedal off with a cooler on his back. Curious, she took her car and followed slow. What she saw that afternoon would change forever the way she looked at that quiet boy in the back of the room. For 2 hours, Bianca watched Marcus ride up and down hills on that bike, delivering lunchboxes door to door, sweating under the sun, always with a polite smile for every customer. He didn't stop for a minute. When he finished the deliveries, he still took the money, counted it coin by coin, and tucked it away careful in his pocket. Bianca, inside the car, started to understand the story here was a whole lot bigger than a dirty shirt. She thought it would end there, but it didn't. From the lunchbox job, Marcus pedaled to a small neighborhood bakery. Bianca parked on the corner and watched, through the window, the boy put on an apron, step into the hot kitchen, and start hauling heavy sacks of flour on his back one after another, sweat running down his forehead. It was almost 7 at night. She'd been there for hours, and his day wasn't even half done. When Marcus came out of the bakery, he had a bag of bread in his hands. Bianca followed again, now to the edge of the neighborhood, a place where the pavement ended and the dirt road began. The boy stopped in front of a small shack with an old wooden door, and that's when Bianca saw the scene that would break her heart. A thin woman, sitting in a chair by the door, broke into a huge smile when she spotted her son coming. 2 kids ran to hug Marcus at the door. He set the bike down, picked up the little one, handed the bread to the girl, and kissed his mother's forehead. From the corner, hidden, Bianca watched that boy the professor called dirty and a liar turn, in an instant, into the father, the brother, and the son holding that whole house up. She brought her hand to her mouth and felt her eyes fill with water. The next day, Bianca worked up the courage and told Marcus, in the hallway, that she'd followed him. He got embarrassed, almost angry, but she held his hand and said, "I didn't come to feel sorry for you. I came because what they're doing to you is wrong, and I'm not going to stay quiet." Little by little, between one break and the next, Marcus started telling her. The father who vanished, the mother with the bad heart, the 3 jobs, the promise he'd made. Little by little, Marcus started trusting Bianca. He told her about the promise he made watching his siblings sleep, about the fear of losing the scholarship, about the nights he slept standing up on the bus. And Bianca, who'd always thought she knew what hardship was, realized she'd never in her life seen anyone carry so much and complain so little. She decided right there that she was going to do something. She couldn't just stand by anymore. Bianca didn't stop there. She went to all 3 places where Marcus worked and asked each boss for a signed statement of his hours. The owner of the truck depot, the owner of the bakery, and the lunchbox man signed on the spot, all of them with the deepest respect for the boy. The bakery owner said, "That kid is the most honest worker I've ever seen, does the work of 2 men and never complained a single time." With the papers in hand, Bianca went and knocked on the door of Professor Helen, the head of the program, a serious and fair woman who'd been teaching there for many years. Bianca laid it all on the desk and told the whole story. The humiliations, the torn exam, the false cheating accusation, and the 3 jobs Marcus worked every night. Professor Helen listened to all of it in silence, and her face got harder and harder. When Bianca finished, Professor Helen took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes, and sat quiet for a while. Then she said, her voice firm, "I've known Professor Hargrove for 20 years. I always knew how he was, but I never had proof. Now I do." She took the documents, put them in a gray folder, and looked at Bianca. She said, "Leave it with me. Next week, there's the auditorium presentation. Everyone present. It'll be there." Before anything else, Professor Helen did her homework right. She pulled Marcus's old exams, compared the handwriting, compared the reasoning, called in 2 other professors to evaluate. The conclusion was unanimous. The boy not only hadn't cheated, he had the best business mind that program had seen in years. Professor Hargrove's accusation was, from start to finish, a lie invented to bring down an innocent boy. Professor Helen set it all up with care. She let Professor Hargrove schedule that auditorium presentation, thinking it would be the day of Marcus's end. She invited the other faculty, the whole class, and, without the boy knowing, sent word for someone very special to be there that day. She was going to let Professor Hargrove climb good and high on his own pride, so the fall would match the size of his arrogance. Marcus, poor kid, knew none of this. He spent the week thinking he was going to the auditorium to be expelled in front of everyone. He worked his nights shaking with fear, rehearsed the presentation under the streetlight, set on doing his best even knowing it might be the end. He never imagined that, instead of the end, that auditorium was about to become the stage for the biggest turn of his life. 3 days to go. The night before, Marcus barely shut his eyes. He did the 3 jobs all the same, because the bills don't wait, but his body was already at its limit. In the dead of night, at the depot, he stopped a second leaning against a truck. pulled the photo of his siblings from his pocket, and stared at it. He thought, "If it all ends tomorrow, at least let me have fought to the very last minute for you." He put the photo away and went back to work. In the morning, before leaving, he stopped by his mother's room. Miss Cora held her son's hand, blessed his forehead the way she used to when he was little, and said softly, "Go with God, son. Whatever happens today, you're already the most honorable man this mother knows." Marcus hugged her tight, promised he'd come back, and left the house in the cleanest shirt he had, which even so still held an old stain of grease. At the college gate, Bianca was waiting. She couldn't tell him the plan, but she grabbed Marcus's arm, looked deep in his eyes and said, "Whatever happens in there, keep your head up. You don't owe anybody a thing. Trust me." Marcus didn't quite understand what she meant, but the firm way she said it gave a strange strength to his chest. He took a deep breath and walked in. The big auditorium filled up little by little. The whole class sat in the front rows, whispering, curious to see what would happen to the raggedy boy. Other professors came in and took the seats along the sides. In the very back, discreet, a few people nobody in the class recognized walked in, and Professor Helen, serious, sat at one end with a gray folder in her lap. The mood was heavy. Professor Hargrove came in last, in a new wine-colored suit, wearing the smile of a man who already knew the ending of the story. He greeted his colleagues with that superior air, looked at Marcus sitting alone in the corner, and couldn't hide his pleasure. To him, this was going to be the day of victory, the day he'd finally rid himself of the nuisance of that poor student who insisted on being better than the others. He climbed onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and said to the audience, in that voice full of himself, "Today isn't just another class. Today we're going to see, in practice, the difference between who belongs in this place and who's only passing through." He looked at Marcus again with contempt and called out, "Go ahead and start. Show everyone what you've got to offer, if you've got anything at all." Marcus stood up, his calloused hands trembling a little, and walked to the stage carrying a simple poster made by hand and the old notebook with the photo of his siblings inside. Nobody in that auditorium imagined that tired boy, in a stained shirt, was minutes away from turning the whole day inside out. Not even he knew it. But Professor Helen, over at the end, squeezed the gray folder in her lap and waited for the right moment. Marcus took a deep breath, faced the audience, and started the presentation. His voice came out kind of shaky at first, but it got steadier. He talked about management, about how to do a lot with a little, about how a small business survives in hard times. And without realizing it, he was talking about his own life. Every example of his was real, was solid ground, was something he lived every day. The professors in the back started glancing at each other, impressed. The class, which had come to laugh, went quiet. That raggedy boy was talking about business better than any of them. Bianca, in the audience, was smiling with pride. But Professor Hargrove wasn't going to let that go on. He felt he was losing control of the scene, that the boy was winning the room and that he couldn't allow. He got up from his chair before Marcus even finished. The professor cut in. "Enough, enough." Climbing onto the stage and stopping in front of the boy so everyone could hear, "You think you can walk into my class smelling like grease, covered in filth, and still expect me to take you seriously?" The room froze. It was the scene that had started it all, now playing out in the packed auditorium, with dozens of people watching in silence. The professor didn't stop. He pointed his finger at Marcus's clothes and kept going, loud, showing off for the audience. "Just look at the state of him. A stain on your clothes is a stain on your character. I've said it before. This right here is the example of what you should not be. A lazy boy who cheated on the exam and now wants to play the winner." A few students laughed uncomfortably. Marcus lowered his head, and his heart squeezed one more time. That's the instant a firm voice cut through the auditorium from back to front. Professor Helen stood up, gray folder in her hand, and spoke loud, without raising her voice more than she needed to. "Professor Hargrove, before you go on, I need to show something to everyone here. Something you should have asked about before you accused this young man." The professor's smile froze on his face. A murmur ran through the audience. Professor Helen climbed onto the stage with calm, decided steps and stood between Professor Hargrove and Marcus. She opened the gray folder slow, in no rush at all, and the silence in the auditorium was so big you could hear people breathing. Professor Hargrove, not understanding, tried to take back control. "Helen, this is my presentation. I don't—" She raised her hand and he went quiet. She began, "You accused this student of cheating," holding the papers up for the audience. "So I took his exams and called in 2 other professors to evaluate them. All 3 reached the same conclusion. This young man has the best business mind this program has seen in years. He didn't cheat, Professor. He's far too good to need to cheat. The lie here wasn't his." Professor Hargrove went red and stammered, But look at the state of him. How does somebody who lives like that, dirty, worn out, get a perfect mark? That's not normal." Professor Helen looked at him, serious, and answered, "Great question, Professor. How does he do it? Do you really want to know the answer in front of everyone? Because I've got it right here." And she pulled the second stack of papers from the folder. She said, her voice louder now, "While you were sleeping in your good bed, this 22-year-old was working. Here are 3 signed statements. From 10 at night to 4 in the morning, he's a watchman and cleaner at a truck depot. That's where the grease you mocked so much comes from. From 5 to 7, he bakes bread at a bakery, and in the afternoon, he delivers lunchboxes by bike. 3 jobs, every single day." A heavy silence fell over the auditorium. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The class that had come to sneer was staring at Marcus now with wide eyes. Bianca was crying quietly in the audience. Professor Hargrove opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The folder of statements passed from hand to hand among the professors, and everyone who read it shook their head, not believing what that boy carried. Professor Helen went on, giving no ground. "And you know why he does it? The father abandoned the family 3 years ago. The mother has a bad heart and can't work. There are 2 little siblings at home. This young man, who you called lazy in front of everyone, is the only one supporting a whole house. He doesn't sleep so that 3 people won't sleep on the street, and he still scores the highest in the class." At that moment, the door at the back of the auditorium opened, and Marcus, on the stage, looked and felt the world stop. Coming in slow, leaning on Lily's arm, with little Pete holding her other hand, was Miss Cora. Professor Helen had sent for the family. The mother looked up at her son, up on the stage, exposed in front of everyone, and broke into that same smile from the doorway at home. Marcus couldn't hold back the tears. Professor Hargrove looked at that thin, sick mother, looked at the 2 children, looked at the grease on the hands of the boy he'd humiliated for months, and something inside him crumbled. All the certainty, all the pride, all the contempt turned to dust in a second. He understood far too late that he'd spent months stepping on the most honorable human being who'd ever walked into that classroom. Professor Helen turned to Professor Hargrove and handed him back, calm, the line he kept repeating. "You go around saying a stain on your clothes is a stain on your character. Well, take a good look at that grease, Professor. That's the cleanest stain that ever set foot in this college. And the dirtiest character in this room today isn't that boy's." Each word landed on the professor like a weight. He dropped his head, with nothing to say. In the middle of that silence, a little voice echoed through the auditorium. Little Pete, the 7-year-old brother, let go of his mother's hand, pointed at the stage, and said loud, with the pride of a child, "That's my brother. He's the one who buys my bread." That was the last straw. Half the auditorium broke down, plenty of people wiping their faces. Marcus, on the stage, covered his mouth with his dirty hand and cried, looking at his little brother. Professor Hargrove stood there watching that scene, and 20 years of arrogance collapsed all at once. He, who'd always talked so loud, now couldn't get a word out. His legs went weak. Slow in front of the whole auditorium, in front of all the students and faculty, The man who thought he was always right bent his knees to the stage floor and covered his face with his hands, overcome with shame. When he managed to speak, his voice came out broken, with none of the swagger from before. "Forgive me, for all of it. I was too small to see the giant you are." He looked at Marcus from down on the floor, his eyes full of water. Marcus, who'd endured months of humiliation in silence, came down off the stage slow, stepped up to the fallen professor, and reached out his hand to help him up. The whole auditorium held its breath. Everyone expected the boy to throw everything he'd suffered right back in the professor's face. But Marcus just took his hand, helped him to his feet, and said low, only 3 words, "It's all right." And that was all. In that moment, it was clear to everyone there who was small and who was great in that story. For a second, the auditorium went mute. And then, starting way in the back, one person clapped, then another, and another, and in seconds the whole auditorium was on its feet, applauding that boy in the grease-stained shirt. They weren't applauding the presentation. They were applauding the man. They were applauding the son, the brother, the worker who held a whole family up, without ever asking anyone for anything. One by one, some of the classmates who'd laughed at him for months came up to Marcus heads down. One of them said, "I'm sorry, man, we didn't know any of it." Marcus just shook each one's hand, holding no grudge. Bianca, at his side, watched it all with a tight chest, proud to have been the only one with the courage to look at him when nobody else would. Marcus came down off the stage and ran into his mother's arms. Miss Cora, crying, held her son's face with both hands and said through the tears, "I was right, son. Time washed it clean." Lily and little Pete hung onto their brother's waist. There, in the middle of the auditorium, that hurt and patched together family was the most beautiful thing that expensive college had seen in a long time. Professor Hargrove, his face still wet, came slow toward the family. He knelt down to the children's height, looked at little Pete, and said, his voice gentle, "Your brother is the bravest man I've ever met. You're very proud of him, aren't you?" The boy nodded yes, all serious. And the professor, who months before had mocked that poor family name, shook the child's dirty little hand with respect. Professor Helen took the microphone one more time and spoke to the whole audience, her voice thick with emotion. "Let today be a lesson to every one of us here, students and faculty. Never, never judge a human being by the clothes they wear. The dirtiest shirt in this room was hiding the cleanest heart. Dignity isn't the suit you buy. It's the weight you carry without letting anyone fall." The whole audience rose again, this time out of respect for Professor Helen and the boy. The other professors, who for years had turned a blind eye to their colleague Hargrove's ways, now understood that their silence had helped hurt that boy too. In that auditorium, on that day, a lot of people learned that staying quiet in the face of injustice is almost as ugly as committing the injustice. That same afternoon, administration threw out the false accusation and restored Marcus's scholarship on the spot. Professor Hargrove was called in for a serious talk with the college leadership, but his biggest punishment didn't come from any piece of paper. It came from inside. It was having to look at himself in the mirror and see for the first time in 20 years the size of the smallness he'd carried all along under that expensive suit. The boy who walked into that auditorium, thinking he'd be expelled, walked out carried on the shoulders of the whole class. The shirt was still the same, stained with grease and sweat. Only now, in everyone's eyes there, those stains had turned into a medal. Each one told the story of a night of work, of a sacrifice of love that no diploma in the world could ever buy. What happened to Professor Hargrove after that day surprised everyone. He didn't disappear, he wasn't fired, but he was never the same again. That arrogant man became a different person. He started coming in earlier, asking every student's name, seeing people for real. The humiliation he'd caused became the mirror that shattered his pride for good. A few months later, Professor Hargrove did something nobody expected. He used his own money and created a fund inside the college to help students who worked to pay their way through school to cover packets, transportation, materials. And he gave the fund a name. He called it the Marcus Program, in honor of the student who'd taught him at 50 years old what dignity really was. The first class of the Marcus program brought in 12 students who worked by day and studied by night, people who without that help would never have finished the course. And Professor Hargrove made a point of learning each one's story, of shaking each one's hand, of never again letting a student's clothes speak louder than their effort. The man had changed from the inside out. Marcus, who had every right to hold a grudge, accepted the apology with an open heart. Over time, the professor became a kind of godfather to him, helped with an internship referral, with advice, with doors that used to be shut. The two of them, who started out as the tormentor and the victim, ended up in an unlikely friendship that both carried for the rest of their lives. Bianca, the girl who didn't stay quiet, stayed by Marcus's side. What started as admiration and outrage turned into something else, deeper, more beautiful. They got together, shared their studies, their dreams, and later on, their life. She always said, laughing, that she fell in love with that boy's dignity long before she fell for the rest of him. The years went by, and the day came that Miss Cora swore she'd see, whatever it cost, her son's graduation. Sitting in the front row, stronger after the treatment the family could finally afford, she watched Marcus climb onto the stage in his cap and gown and take his diploma. Beside her, Lily, already a young woman, and Pete, bigger now, clapped on their feet, and way in the back, clapping louder than anyone, was Professor Hargrove. The graduation was in the same auditorium where, years earlier, Marcus had nearly been expelled. On the same stage where he'd been humiliated, he was now being named the best student in the class. When he took the microphone to speak on behalf of the graduates, he searched for two faces in the audience, his mother's and the professor's, the man who'd learned right alongside him. And his first words went to the family he never let fall. Today, Marcus has his own company, a distribution business that employs dozens of people, and he makes a point of giving the first chance to exactly the kind of person who shows up in worn clothes with calloused hands. His mother lives in a good house. His siblings went to school, and that two-room shack is a memory now. The grease stains are gone from his clothes, but the lesson they taught, that he carries to this day. Because in the end, Marcus proved something a lot of people in expensive suits will never understand. The worth of a man isn't in what he wears, it's in the weight he can carry without complaining. Real dignity doesn't shine, doesn't smell like perfume. A lot of the time it smells like grease and sweat. And it usually lives exactly where the arrogant least expect to find it. Now let me ask you something. Do you believe life always ends up showing the true worth of the ones who suffer in silence? Or are there people who carry the weight of the world and never get recognized? Tell me down in the comments. And if you've ever lived through something like this, share your story. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, go ahead and hit that like button. Then subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story.